This week we're going to discuss Chapter 1, which is how to summarize. What is a summary? A summary is simply a shortened version of an original text. It includes the thesis and the major supporting details of your original piece, and it should include a discussion about how the major ideas work together in that piece. It's always written in your own words, and it can include examples from the text. However, it should never be more than 25% of the length of the original piece. When you're writing a summary, your summary should always answer the journalist's questions. These are also called the 5 W's and 1 H. They simply stand for who, what, when, where, why, and how. If your summary can answer all of those questions, it's very likely that your summary is a complete breakdown of the original piece. Read, reread, and highlight. The technical term for this is called annotating. When you annotate a reading, it should be messy. There should be highlights, underlining, notes in the margins. That way you make sure that you understand what you're actually reading. You cannot annotate without making the reading messy, and most people cannot write something correctly without understanding it. Therefore, the messier the original piece is, the more likely your summary is going to be accurate. There's also an example of this in your book on pages 13 through 14. Notice that something in each paragraph is important on that example. They've highlighted something, they've got notes about every paragraph. This indicates that the person who annotated this work has found major supporting details for the piece's thesis statement. Drafts. There is no correct number of drafts required before you submit your final draft. However, you can be assured that your initial draft will never, ever, ever be your final draft. Writing has 4 main parts. First is brainstorming. Second is drafting, which may include several versions of the original. The third is revising and editing, and the fourth is just that final proofread to make sure everything's perfect before you submit it. So why do we write summaries? Summarizing someone else's work often makes it easier for you to understand what you have read. If you're researching proof for an argumentative essay, you may need to familiarize yourself with a particular concept or strategy written by someone else. When summaries are contained within a paper, they help to substantiate your claim. When you take the time to summarize several articles, you will see more clearly how they link together. And then that helps you when you're writing your essay to pull information and support from several places so that you get a conglomeration of information that puts everything together. Summaries help you write analysis and synthesis, and that is at the heart of academic writing. They're also used when you need a brief restatement. So now that we've discussed summaries, we need to go on to how to paraphrase. Paraphrasing is very similar to summarizing. Like summarizing, you use your own words. When you paraphrase, you rewrite someone else's ideas in your own words. So why do you do that? Why can't you just quote it? Well, the main reasons is your academic papers need to be written in your own voice. They need to contain original thought, and they need to show that you have mastered the subject you are writing about. A paper full of quotes is difficult for a reader to read because you end up with lots of different ways that things are said, and it sounds more like a laundry list as opposed to how all these different ideas link together and help form your own opinion. And again, paraphrasing shows your reader that you understand the material, can analyze it, and can apply it to your argument. When you need to follow the development of your source closely, you would use paraphrasing. You must include an in-text citation in an entry on your Works Cited page. Now that is different from a summary because you don't necessarily have to include an in-text citation, but you always will with a paraphrase. So now let's move on to how to quote. Quotes are used when you want to use someone else's exact words in your paper. Quoting is like cooking with pungent spices. There is a point at which you can ruin the recipe. For example, I love garlic, but When I follow a Rachel Ray recipe, I know I have to cut the amount of garlic and the amount of onions in half, otherwise I can't stand the food I make. Sometimes quoting the author is the best way to support your argument, but you must use quotes sparingly and deliberately. When I was in grad school, I had a teacher tell me that you won't want quotes in more than 10 to 15% of your paper. A lot of teachers kind of shy away from giving you percentages as far as how much of something to include or not include. But I think it's kind of helpful to give you an idea that 90% of what's coming out of your essay needs to be your own original thought and your own original words. You must include an in-text citation and an entry on your Works Cited page anytime you quote. So, how do you choose when to use quotations and when to use paraphrases? Simply quote source material when it's worded so eloquently or powerfully that to summarize or paraphrase it would be to sacrifice much of the impact and the significance of the meaning. So, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Quoting that because it's such a powerful speech is better than just summarizing it, because he had a lot of good vocabulary in there that drove home particular points that supported his argument beautifully. The same is true of Reagan's City Upon a Hill speech. He said it better than probably anybody else would be able to say it, so you'd quote directly in those situations. So how do you incorporate quotes into your paper the right way? You always have to frame a quote within a context of your argument. You never use a freestanding quotation like this example below. Various people associated with the university admit that pressures of athleticism have caused a relaxation of standards. These gentry often overlook the fact that a college should not be interested in a fullback who is a half-wit. But this kind of thinking is bad for the university and even worse for athletes. A freestanding quotation is jarring to the reader. You notice that the sentence that discusses the gentry and half-wits and fullbacks is not written like the other two sentences that surround it, so we know it's someone else's voice. But we aren't introduced to whose voice that is or why that should matter. You must use a signal phrase that attributes the source. The in-text citation is not enough. So, to correct the problem of the previous example, as Robert Hutchins notes, these gentry often overlook the fact that a college should not be interested in a fullback who is a half-wit. And notice how I've done the in-text citation. Since we gave Robert Hutchins' name in the sentence, we would only include the page number in the citation. You can also interrupt the quote with who said it, and that also gives you a good signal phrase. These gentry, asserts Robert Hutchins, often overlook the fact that a college should not be interested in a fullback who is a half-wit. And lastly, but Robert Hutchins disagrees. These gentry often overlook the fact that a college should not be interested in a fullback who is a half-wit. Notice that last example has a colon. You can use a colon to introduce indented quotations. So that's ones that are over 3 lines long that are block quotations. The key is that the colon must come after a complete sentence. So, but Robert Hutchins disagrees is actually a complete sentence, a subject and a predicate. When you're writing, avoid phrases or words like states, writes, and says. Instead, use stronger verbs like asserts, argues, maintains, insists, asks, wonders. These are more vivid. Using ellipses. Sometimes you will find a quote that is very long and would support your argument, but there's extraneous points in the middle of it. In those instances, it's best to use ellipses to omit the unnecessary stuff. So let's look at this example from Thoreau's Walden. To read well, that is to read true books in a true spirit, a noble exercise, and one that will task the reader more than any exercise which the customs of the day esteem. It requires a training such as the athletes underwent, the steady intention almost of the whole life to this object. Books must be read as deliberately and reservedly as they were written. So in order to use that quote, since you probably don't need all of it, here's an example. Reading well is hard work, writes Henry David Thoreau in Walden, that will task the reader more than any exercise which the customs of the day esteem. Books must be read as deliberately and reservedly as they were written. The ellipsis only replaces words omitted in a sentence. So if you'll notice, an ellipsis itself is simply 3 periods in a row. But in the example, I have 4 periods. That's because the first period is the ending of the sentence that ends in esteem, and then the ellipsis, and then the new sentence begins. And we've kept the capital letter there. Using brackets to add substitute words. You would use brackets when you need to substitute words in a quoted sentence. You do this for clarity, okay? So, for example, Golden Press's Walt Disney's Cinderella set the new pattern for America's Cinderella. This book's text is coy and condescending. Sample, and her best friends of all were, guess who? The mice. The illustrations are poor cartoons, and Cinderella herself is a disaster. She cowers as her sisters rip her homemade ball gown to shred, not even homemade by Cinderella, but by the mice and birds. She answers her stepmother with whines and pleadings. She is a sorry excuse for a heroine, pitiable and useless. She cannot perform even a simple action to save herself, though she is warned by her friends, the mice. She does not hear them because she is off in a world of dreams. Cinderella begs. She whimpers. And at last she has to be rescued by guess who? The mice. So we've got a whole paragraph here all about what a terrible heroine Cinderella is. And if you're going to use this source as an example to substantiate your points, you want to use whatever in this is most supports your argument. So for the sake of argument, say you want to quote, she answers her stepmother with whines and pleadings. Now, if you are in the middle of a paper and you don't know who she is, you need to tell your readers Cinderella. If you simply just put she in there, we aren't going to know who she is. So to fix this, Jane Yolen believes that Cinderella is a sorry excuse for a heroine, pitiable and useless. Or you could say, Jane Yolen believes that the Golden Press version, Cinderella, is a sorry excuse for a heroine, pitiable and useless. Okay, so in the first example, we've used the brackets to replace she with Cinderella. In the second example, we haven't even started our quote until we've said Cinderella, then we open the quote. And again, notice that we've said the author's name in the sentence itself. So the in-text citation would just be the page number.